Well, Bill, thanks for taking time for the set.
My pleasure. A lot of fun.
You and I had a lot of fun in Barcelona a couple of weeks ago.
We did. We did.
We had a subject that I think you're one of the thought leaders in our industry on. I'm throwing that on you. You're not self-proclaimed, but I'll throw it on you. With Canary and the enablement of data off of what's classically inert medical devices.
Yep.
And I'm sure a lot of the industry knows who you are, but the thesis behind Canary, and then you and I want to sort of riff back and forth about this gold mine of data people talk about.
Yeah. Yeah, no, I always get in trouble for saying this because it sounds too trite, but we live in an era where household appliances are connected to the internet. And then we have, these life-saving medical devices, some of whom, when they go wrong, cost hundreds of thousands of dollars and all kinds of morbidity associated with things, and they're not connected, they're not self-reporting, they don't provide any feedback, and that just seems to me that an unsustainable position. And 10 years ago we could say the technology didn't exist to do it, but now the technology exists to do it. And so if you and I are still around 5 years from now, I suspect having most major medical devices connected will be fairly commonplace.
But do all device companies want to have evidence come out based on what you and I know about devices?
I think I can safely say that there are very few companies that are courageous enough to be the first, because everybody reports their complication rate based on highly controlled clinical trials, and I think we all know that in the real world it's a lot messier than that. Yeah. And if you kind of go on record and prove what your device does and doesn't do, and your competitors don't, you're kind of naked. I think that's a great place to be. I think that's transparent. I think that makes physicians want to use your device more. But a lot of companies are like, no, I think I'd rather be a follower in that area than a leader, because they may not really want to know what the real world performance of their device.
So you talk about the physicians, the providers. Wouldn't the payers want that evidence-based outcome as well?
Oh, absolutely. So that's what's going to move the needle, right? I mean, the analogy I always use is the auto industry and sensors, right? So, back when they put rear view sensors and camera, the average driver said, I'm an amazing driver. I can back out of my driveway. I don't need sensors. And the insurance industry said, yeah, that's great, except 30% of our claims involve some sort of rear end collision, so we want you to have it. And in fact, we'll incentivize you to have it by lowering your rates if you do that. And so I think that's what we're going to see at another level. And then once the consumer gets used to having it, I mean, we know our patients love being able to look at their phone and see what's going on. That they love it. I wouldn't buy a car that didn't have, forget rear sensors, but lane change assistance, automatic braking, everything, right? Because once you can diagnose and then you can treat, now you're starting to bring real value to the system, and the value is not just apparent to the insurer, it becomes apparent to the customer as well, and I think that's what we're going to see in medicine.
And you've obviously picked certain categories to go into to add sensor and intelligence to those. What were the drivers of those, and what do you hope to be the next categories that adopt that?
So I'd like to lie, but the honest answer is, this is the stem from a Persona knee. And 5 years ago when we were in front of the FDA, this was the smallest thing we could build. Right, it was about the size of a AAA battery, and knee replacements were the only thing that could take it. So we became an orthopedics company. Most of my team are all cardiovascular in background, and so now this is what we have in front of the FDA right now. And that's not because we're smart, that's because battery technology keeps getting better, sensor technology is lower power draw, and we can put that into all kinds of things. I mean, now, we can throw that into a hip,
And the fidelity of data coming out of that is just probably significant.
This has more power than the bigger device, right? So I think what you'll see is kind of a race towards miniaturization, and the smaller you get, then exponentially you can go into more and more things. So start off in orthopedics, spine's probably our next foray, but our first cardiovascular monitors go in human beings in the next couple of months. So, we're getting small enough to start looking at vascular complications as well.
And are those going to be in devices themselves, or will they be an onboard sensor like a CardioMEMS?
It's going to be a combination of both. The smallest device we make is to actually drop into an aneurysm sac to be able to tell bleeding or not. On the other hand, if you're looking at just, physiologic monitoring of the cardiovascular system, I think that's going to be more, like a link system design, almost like a pacemaker battery that goes on the precordium. So it'll be a blend. We're not at the stage yet where we can drop something onto a heart valve, but I think we can monitor heart valves distally. So, it's coming in bits and pieces. Typically what we do if we're going to be on a device is we need to have one part of the device that is non-structural, kind of dead space. And if that dead space is big enough, then we can fill it and we can onboard. If we can't onboard, then we need to monitor, from a distance.
How has the FDA handled this? Because they're constantly upgrading guidance when it comes to first of all, software as a medical device, then the sensor technology, then an active implant.
Yep. It's really common to bash FDA, and I've probably been guilty of it at times in my career too, but they have been super helpful. If you think about it, I forget how many years ago it was, but FDA actually was asking device manufacturers to be able to track their products with higher fidelity. Now, we're probably over-engineered for that purpose, but essentially we fill that purpose. And so, FDA's been really great. They've said, look, prove to me that you don't harm the device. Like, prove to me that the fit, form, and function of the device is, unaffected, that, that stem is still as good as a regular stem. And if you do that, I'm not gonna say take it on faith, but we believe that collecting data has value and collecting novel data has value. And so we're gonna pave the way for you for doing that as opposed to making an impediment. And we got breakthrough 3 times. We got on knee, we got on hip, we got on shoulder. And that was probably at their urging more than ours. So I think FDA wants to have more information on, important medical devices.
So help me understand. So you're able to retrospectively go back on a cleared device already, and then take a sensor, incorporate on that, and does it change the responsibility of the OEM on that? Where does that fall in from a performance liability clearance approval perspective?
Not so much the liability piece, but if you think of that stem, so obviously nothing's going to be as good as solid stainless steel, right? But and we're hollowing it out and we're doing different things, but we had to show that physiologically we didn't change that. And so the shear force to break this in half is lower than the shear force to break steel in half. But the shear force to break this in half is greater than the shear force of the human limb. So as long as we were engineered well enough to do what we had to do, and we didn't change, again, the fit, form, or function, which is classic regulatory definition, they were supportive of that. If you have to change the function of the device, that's going to be a higher hurdle. You're going to have to show that, it doesn't alter the basic properties, mechanical properties of the implant.
You and I had a conversation, as I mentioned earlier, when we were in Barcelona, about all the aggregation of data.
Right.
And certainly our providers, our clinicians, I don't know if they have any more time in their day to spend, even if we could get the throughput and the patient monitoring down. What are some of the options we have moving forward in the healthcare continuum that may need evaluation if we really want to impact care by the use of these data sets?
That's a really good question. And I'll try and answer it succinctly. Something else we talked about is that, when you start a data business, whatever you want to call it, you kind of start as a monitoring company because the first thing you're able to do is kind of collect and follow data, right? And that has value, but it's kind of only a small percentage of what's possible. The next thing you have to be able to do is is what I'm collecting normal or abnormal? Can I, look at that data and I'm not going to say make a diagnosis, but can I bifurcate my patients into happy and unhappy patients? And then you have to be able to filter that information. So you start as a monitoring company, and then I think you become a diagnostics company. And we do these things called recovery curves, where we show where the patient's data is, whether in the 95th percentile or the 5th percentile, are they normal or abnormal? That's great, but if we just dumped all that data onto the clinician, that would be overwhelming as opposed to helpful, right? And so that's where machine learning comes in. Then you can, if you can filter all that data and come up with actionable stuff saying, so here's my 800 patients, here's the 10 I need to look for. We call it from the need of the phone, like, can I pick up my iPhone on a Monday morning and see the 5 patients I need to see? Mm-hmm. If you can do that, now you're starting to, do something diagnostic. You're starting to do something of value. And that's kind of where we're at now. The last step is really what I would call patient management. And so if we go to all that trouble, but you don't change the management of the patient, then you've accomplished nothing at all. So if we highlight, that your knee is falling behind, but nobody steps in and increases the physio or checks to make sure you have an infection or actually takes over your management, then all of it was just an exercise in theatrics, right? So you start out with monitoring, then you do diagnosis, but ultimately somebody has to take that diagnosis and do something with it. Otherwise, you don't ever change the outcome. And ultimately, that's what we got to do in medicine, not just for the patient, but to get paid. We got to show that we're going to make an improvement in outcome. And so you kind of march up the data pathway along that way. We're now just starting to tip our toe into the water of management.
So when you look at Canary, so you started out as a sensor development company, and then you then become obviously familiar with data and reliability and the power of data. That's one entity. So is it feasible for a startup to have that responsibility and then grow to be able to manage thousands or tens of thousands of lives? Or what do you forecast that future to look like? Will there be just client patient management companies, device companies that then partner with the Canary, and then a new entity evolves?
Yeah. That, based on no facts whatsoever. If you look at the technology sector, right, you couldn't be a component company until you had a component economy, right? So, the initial innovators, the IBMs and the Apples, they had to be fully integrated, right? Only then can Intel come in and other people come in and fragment the business, and you can have subspecialists. But initially you have to be kind of fully integrated, because there's no room for a component manufacturer when nobody has components, right? So I think right now where we are is that you've got to be fully integrated. That was probably the biggest mistake, if you will, of mine. I didn't realize we were going to have to raise a lot of money and be able to do the full thing all the way through. But 5 years from now, no, you should be able to segment it. There should be people that are sensor specialists. There'll be people who are RPM specialists. There'll be people who are patient management specialists. A little bit like we've seen in diabetes, right? Mm-hmm. You start out with the monitor, you start out with the continuous glucose monitoring, then you get to kind of managing that data, and then ultimately you get into patient management on the back end of it. And that's starting to be separated. It's not all done by one entity anymore. And I think that's what will happen. But right now, to get your foothold, you probably have to be able to go from start to finish until the industry gets big enough to pick off different pieces of it as a contractor.
So it doesn't mean that we have to put a sensor on board of every device, does it?
No. I think it always comes down to the clinical value proposition. Right? It takes a decent amount of time to explain why collecting kinematics from a knee could ultimately help you detect infection or DVT. There's a lot that goes into that. But in other indications, it's pretty obvious. If I knew my aneurysm was leaking, that's a life or death intervention, right? I mean, if your AAA graft starts to leak, you may never find out. Right. Let's put it that way. Right. If on the other hand, I knew that was happening, there's lots of ways to correct that, and that can help. So I think we're going to have, it's going to depend. Some devices, it doesn't matter what they initially cost, it's what they treat, and what they treat can be really, really valuable. Other things, I don't think everything's going to have to be connected, and some of the stuff will be, not medically necessary. But in life-saving or debilitating conditions, whether the device costs $200,000 or $2, being able to diagnose its failure preemptively could be worth a lot of money, and that's ultimately where you have to go.
Well, I mean, it's no doubt that this is the future where MedTech's going, and love watching what Canary's doing, and I love the conversations it's forcing right now in the industry for sure.
Yeah, I think we first started this 12 years ago, and I went to device companies and they said, why in the world would I want to do that? I've been doing this 20 years this way, it's worked out just fine. And I think when the knee came out, people looked at it as a bit of a curiosity, but being here today, and I really feel like it's happening now. People are saying, okay, everything else in my world's digital, everything else in my world is connected. We don't have enough healthcare workers to do everything manually. We're going to have to do some of this stuff remotely. We're going to have to do some of this stuff, algorithmically. And I think, over the next 5-6 years could be a really exciting time.
Well, thanks so much for spending the time and sharing the vision on this. I know you're probably pretty busy here today. People tugging at your jacket now with what you've completed at Canary.
Thank you. It's been a lot of fun.
Thanks so much.
Cheers.
I'm Joe Mullings from the MedTech conference in Anaheim. Be well.